In the years post the famous win at Agincourt in 1415, Henry V had started to take over France, conquering Ivry, Falaise, the birthplace of William the Conqueror, and the city of Caen, all in 1417. As the English war machine carved its way through France, they laid siege to Rouen, the capital of Normandy, and the city surrendered in 1419. With Henry slaughtering his way through the French, the Treaty of Troyes was created in 1420, recognising him as the legitimate heir to the French throne upon the death of King Charles VI, placing most of northern France under his control. Just a month later, on the 2nd of June, Henry married Catherine of Valois, the daughter of Charles VI, in Troyes Cathedral. Everything was falling into place and Henry was on the brink of greatness, returning to England in late 1420 to manage his political affairs. As fate would have it, Henry's greatest challenge would be caused by his own brother, Thomas of Lancaster, the Duke of Clarence, who was left in charge of the English-held territories in France. Thomas was the second son of Henry IV, born in 1387, and at the age of 14 he was shipped off to Ireland by his father and appointed Lord Lieutenant. He had a very similar role to Henry, who himself was sent away to Wales after becoming its prince in 1399. They were both part of an expedition to invade Scotland under their father's command in 1400. So from an early age, these brothers were put into political roles where they both had to learn how to fight. While doing their duties, both brothers were nearly killed. Thomas in 1406 after a skirmish in Dublin, and Henry in 1403 at the Battle of Shrewsbury after being hit in the face with an arrow. In 1411 their father and king became ill and Henry became head of the royal council, preparing to eventually take over the crown. During this time the young Prince Henry was making his own plans as king while their father still ruled. After defying the king's wishes, persuading the council to declare war on France, his father removed him from the council and his brother Thomas was given his seat. A year later, in 1412, an army of 4,000 men would be sent to fight against John the Fearless and take control of land that was promised to them in Guyenne. Unfortunately for King Henry IV, he is too ill to command the army, and someone of royal blood is needed to lead the English into battle, and the chosen prince is Thomas. Thomas is building a reputation over in France as his army cuts through French towns. With the English army advancing, the Armagnacs and Burgundians that were previously at war have decided to settle their differences and try to pay Thomas a large sum of money to return to England. Thomas declines and marches on to Bordeaux and succeeds in restoring control over Guyenne. In 1413 the king was taken ill to his bed, which would ultimately be his deathbed. Henry visits him in his last moments, and even with all of the conflicts between them over the years, his father asks him to settle any debts the crown has, to engage with God, and to stop the quarrelling with his brother Thomas. Henry tells his father that he will defend the crown for his entire life, and even with his seemingly favourable treatment of Thomas, Henry IV passes away, leaving the crown to Henry. It's quite possible that this treatment of Henry was to teach him a valuable lesson, and it seems that there were never really any intentions to have Thomas crowned instead. The newly crowned Henry V had a grand vision, which was to effectively conquer all of France, having a unified Anglo-French empire and establishing a dynasty that ruled over both kingdoms. The start of this was in 1415, where a huge army was built to move on France, remembering the triumphs of his great-grandfather Edward III at Crécy and Calais. Thomas was appointed one of the leaders, as his previous experiences of war in France will be invaluable to Henry. At this point the two brothers have matured out of their petty arguments, and Thomas has supported Henry with the utmost loyalty since he was crowned king. During the siege of Harfleur, Thomas took an army on a march to gain an advantageous spot on top of a hill called Mont Cabert. He was very much an active leader in battle, reacting quick to take advantage of the enemy where opportunity showed itself. Thomas has a great reputation as a soldier and he's known for his bravery, but at times he could also be extremely reckless, leading attacks on city walls. During the siege of Harfleur, Thomas contracted dysentery and was too sick to continue in battle, so he reluctantly returned to England with the other ill and injured soldiers. This was a common but serious illness at the time, and it was one that was deadly to many. And while Thomas loved war, he was in no state to fight, and it had to be the right decision to return home to try to recover. The problem for Thomas at this moment was not that he was ill, but he was about to miss one of the most famous victories in English history at the Battle of Agincourt in October of 1415. It's very possible that his absence from Agincourt after recovering from his illness gave him the mindset that he must prove himself after missing such a historic battle, which inevitably would lead to taking more risks. By 1417, the brothers are back in France, laying siege to the town of Caen, where once again Thomas is throwing himself into action on the eastern side of the town, slaughtering everyone in his path. The English army takes Caen, and Thomas is then sent to capture towns in Lower Normandy, and true to the pattern of the English during this period, he is again successful in doing so. In 1418, a crucial point in the capture of Normandy was the siege of Rouen. This was a huge task for Henry and his army, but as expected, nothing is getting in their way. Henry splits his army into four, with Thomas once again chosen to command a quarter of it. Henry has blocked off the river with English troops sailing up and down the river on patrol to make sure that the French can't get to Rouen, and the tactics are to starve them out. There are attempts from citizens of Rouen to get aid from Paris, but the help never arrives, as John the Fearless is very aware that leaving Paris to come to the aid of Rouen could effectively give the country to Henry if he was to lose. A risk far too large, and one he wasn't willing to take, leaving Rouen as a sacrificial lamb. After months of starving out Rouen, the French finally cave and surrender in January of 1419. This is a major coup for Henry, and with the fall of Rouen he has effectively conquered most of Normandy. In September of the same year, there's a meeting set to take place between John the Fearless and the 16-year-old Dauphin, Charles, to start rebuilding what has become a war-torn country. The meeting is set up on the bridge of Montreux, where the Dauphin is waiting for John. Honour and peace is not on the mind of the Dauphin, he is out for blood, and as John approaches he nods to one of his men, who hits John the Fearless with an axe. While the order of murder sounds cold from a 16-year-old, especially under these circumstances, it is in fact revenge for his uncle, Louis, the Duke of Orleans, who had been assassinated by John the Fearless's men in 1407. With John the Fearless now dead, this is great news for Henry, and in 1420 the Treaty of Troyes was agreed, where Henry is declared the heir to the French throne upon the death of Charles VI, and he is to marry Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the king. An incredible moment for Henry, whose grand vision is coming to fruition. But not so for the Dauphin, who has just seen his future crown handed to an outsider. Through 1420, Henry gets married, travels through France, and spends Christmas in Paris, recognised as the heir to the French throne. While this is a great moment for Henry, he cannot forget that he's the King of England, and his people want to see him and his new queen. He must also fulfil his duties as the ruler of the country, and with this in mind, Henry makes his way to Calais, returning to England by February of 1421, leaving his capable but impulsive brother Thomas as his deputy over his French territories. With Thomas leading the English, Henry is back home raising funds for his troops in France when he is approached by a messenger with the terrible news that the English army in France has been defeated by the French for the first time in around 80 years. Thomas was made aware of a French and Scottish army that was camped nearby at the town of Bourget. In true Thomas fashion, where opportunity presents itself, we must not hesitate, so the decision was made to surprise them with an attack. He was so quick to try and capitalise on what he thought was a great opportunity of redemption from missing Agincourt, he did so without getting his archers in place. Surprise them he did, but without archers and being heavily outnumbered, Thomas suffered a terrible defeat and was killed in the battle, along with the loss of many strong captains. This was a monumental and unnecessary blunder, losing a large part of the army and giving a huge boost to the morale of the French, spelling disaster for Henry, something he is going to have to make right very quickly. With this huge blunder by Thomas, the consequences were terrible. Was this the big contributing factor to Henry's early demise? Besides losing his brother, this defeat was the first significant defeat for a long time for the English. As well as boosting the morale of the French, it would also reduce that of the English army, who at one point seemed untouchable, making the myth of the invincible English army disappear. With this defeat, it also meant that Henry had to make an earlier return to France in June of 1421 to try and recover from a major defeat, which disrupted his plans in England. It also slowed down the expansion of English control, giving Henry many more challenges going forward. Henry did start to recover France in 1421 and captured key towns to strengthen English power once again. The issue in France now was that the Dauphin was suddenly gaining more courage, and while the Treaty of Troyes still made Henry the heir to the throne, the resistance in the French territories started to increase. A key ally of Henry, the Burgundians, started to doubt England's ability to hold power after the loss by Thomas at Bourget. While the Dauphin was feeling courageous at this point, he still wouldn't fight Henry, showing that the fear was still present. In 1422, Henry continued his military success with the siege of Meaux, despite suffering from an illness. Whilst he was successful with the siege, the long grueling attack made things worse and his body was being worn down. In August of that year, Henry was at his weakest and he started to make arrangements for his inevitable passing. On the 31st of August in 1422, the great warrior king of England, Henry V, died at the age of 35. His dream of a unified Anglo-French empire died with him. His death left a fragile kingdom, an infant king, and a nation spiralling towards the Wars of the Roses. I've been curious about how much of an effect this mistake actually had on Henry's legacy. He had to go back to France at a point that wasn't planned and repair the mistakes with a much lesser army in terms of numbers, but also in terms of the loss of experienced knights, captains and soldiers. If his brother wasn't so reckless, do you think Henry could have gone on to achieve the unthinkable and conquer the whole of France? He also dreamed of following in the footsteps of Richard the Lionheart and Edward I and to try and take control of the Holy Land with a crusade, but this was cut short way too early and he never had the opportunity. How far could Henry have gone and what could he have actually achieved? Do you think that while the loss at Bourget was a contributing factor, his early death was inevitable with the huge ambitions he had? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments about how big this mistake actually was by his brother and whether or not he could have gone on to achieve greatness. Thanks for watching and I'll see you soon.